For them, the viewpoint is maybe, hey, the West and NATO have been expanding slowly and gradually, and all of a sudden they're on the doorsteps here of Russia. What is this country supposed to do? Or the West in general has been kind of doing what they will. And we've talked about this argument of whataboutism before, right? It always comes to, well, America does this all the time. You know, they have bases all over the world. What about the Iraq War? That's what I heard over and over and over again when I tried to bring this up. So let's answer this argument. From your point of view, make the strongest argument you can why history will look back and judge Putin and Russia as the aggressors and the bad guys in this situation?
Because they attacked their neighbors and are killing thousands of innocent people and are doing it gleefully, right?
Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Denari. My name is Sirish Pulusani, and today it's February 25th. It's actually the day after the one-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I just want to, obviously we're going to be talking about this. I just want to give a quick recap. On February 24th, 2022, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russia-Ukrainian war that actually started in 2014, this conflict, in fact, and I'll have you maybe expand on that. But the invasion since then has caused tens of thousands of deaths on both sides. It instigated Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. And over the last year, Russia's assault has turned more than 8 million Ukrainians into refugees, prompted the U.S. to accuse Russia of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and revived fears of nuclear conflict. This is the biggest kind of worldwide conflict we have seen, likely since World War II. It's 1 year on, Paul. So just take us back briefly, give us an understanding of what we've learned over the course of the past year.
Yeah, there have been a lot of surprises. The first thing we've learned is that Russia is not the country we thought it was. Up until the invasion started, I didn't think they would do this. So Russia's a different country, both internally and externally, than we thought it was. Equally important, Ukraine's not the country we thought it was, right? Everybody thought Russia would knock Ukraine out of this war very, very quickly. The Ukrainians have fought much more competently and much more valiantly than anybody expected. The Western alliance maybe is not what Putin thought it was either. He thought it would crumble and acquiesce in this. And maybe if he'd won the war quickly, it would have. But the Western alliance is holding together, not perfectly, but mostly. I think the couple other big surprises that we just need to keep mind of, a year out, because we've almost forgotten about them now, is not only the surprise that Russia invaded and that Ukraine resisted so well. Sanctions did not have the effect a lot of people predicted that they would. Russia's done okay economically, and there's been almost no domestic pressure on Putin to end this war. We thought there might be protests. We thought people would resist. We've seen a little bit of that, but mostly people have not said very much. Russia's become a much more authoritarian country than it was before this war. And people have just tried to get on with their lives, or if they've been conscripted, they've gone off to war and in many cases died. So there have been a lot of surprises.
Yeah, I mean, you captured quite a few of those surprises. The first off is obviously Russia had planned to take Kiev in 3 days, and now here we are 1 year later. So a surprise on the Ukrainian side. Putin completely miscalculated his hand, it seems like. But on the other hand, you brought up something very interesting, which I didn't really anticipate, is the war has been dragging on. Russia has been cut off from the world economy. And at the same time, we haven't seen a lot of stuff coming out of Russia where there's demonstrations against Putin or anything else like that. Whereas we actually saw that previous to the war. We saw the rise of Alexander Navalny, all these, dissident groups. But is it just a sign of how much more authoritarian Russia has become at this point?
Yeah, Putin has very effectively used the war to quash domestic, not just domestic criticism, but any remaining independent domestic actors, right? Non-governmental organizations, media organizations. There were still some of those that had some latitude, Navalny's group just being one of many. He's used this war to crush them all. I don't think that's the reason why he waged the war, but it's certainly been a very convenient byproduct of the war for him.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that there's any signs of war fatigue in Russia? I mean, there must be, I assume. I mean, the rest of the world is even feeling the effects of this, but it must be even more significant in Russia, I feel.
I suspect that it is, but I think the average Russian is patriotic. And as much as they probably have misgivings about the war, they don't want their country to lose. And they don't want to be branded, if you're a young man who's conscripted to go into the service. Some will flee the country. Some will try to avoid it. But many will say, boy, I don't think this is such a hot idea, but if I'm conscripted, I will go fight. I know any number of my friends and colleagues and former students who never thought the U.S. war in Iraq was such a hot idea, but they went and fought as bravely and valiantly as they could because that's what you do. Mm-hmm. And I don't think the Russians are fundamentally different in that respect.
Absolutely, and they actually have a long, long history of putting up some of the most significant fights in the history. Stalingrad comes to mind as far as the resilience of the Russian people, right?
Yeah. Let me jump in though. I want to quiz you here for a minute. You said Russia's been cut off from the world economy. Well, not exactly, right? Russia's been cut off from the West's economy partly, but of course, Europe continued to have to buy gas from Russia, which gives them a lot of. But India, right? India's been buying a lot of the oil that the West has not been buying. China has not been supplying with arms, but there's been still plenty of trade. One of the interesting things is that much of the rest of the world is pretty content to carry on trade with Russia, even potentially using this as a way to take advantage of the fact that they may now be able to get better prices. So I know you were just in India.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, what's the sentiment there? I mean, obviously, it's a big country, but let's hear what you have to say.
No, great. Not only is it a big country, Paul. Yeah, I was just there for 2 weeks, and while I was there, officially, India became the most populous country on the planet. So it crossed China, over 1.4 billion people. The conversation there is it's long been the most populous country. The census is just way off. There's way more people than China, and it's always been that way. But you brought up a great point in that the two biggest countries in the world with the most population, they represent almost a third of the world population, China and India, are still trading with Russia, right? It's not the West, and we're very West centric over here. Obviously, I live in Los Angeles. You live close by, so that's the point of view here. But yeah, in India, it is quite different, and even the viewpoint of the war is very different. And I'm going to ask you some questions here about that, but I do want to talk about this some more because they have a different opinion about Putin and Russia. And this goes back kind of to the past, the conflict between India and Pakistan, who supported Pakistan back in the day, who supported India back in the day, even back to the Cold War moments. But, there certainly is a different viewpoint there on this war. And it was very kind of insightful to see that. But, for a typical Indian citizen, Russia is not necessarily the aggressor even, right? For them, the viewpoint is maybe, hey, the West and NATO have been expanding slowly and gradually, and all of a sudden they're on the doorsteps here of Russia. What is this country supposed to do? Or the West in general has been kind of doing what they will. And we've talked about this argument of whataboutism before, right? It always comes to, well, America does this all the time. They have bases all over the world. What about the Iraq war? That's what I heard over and over and over again when I tried to bring this up. So let's answer this argument. From your point of view, make the strongest argument you can why history will look back and judge Putin and Russia as the aggressors and the bad guys in this situation?
Because they attacked their neighbors and are killing thousands of innocent people and are doing it gleefully, right? Not merely attacking their neighbors and trying to seize the territory of a sovereign independent state, but saying quite openly their goal is to end the notion of a separate Ukrainian people. Now, we can get in a long debate about the definition of genocide, but that comes close enough so that I don't see how any right-minded person, no matter how cranky you are at the United States for our misdeeds, seems to think that's okay. And in fact, that's what blows my mind, right? If you don't like imperialism, if you don't like what the United States has done in the past, then you should really, really, really not like what Russia's doing now. And so that's what I understand, that it's like, if these guys are bad, these guys must be good. But if this behavior is bad, then that behavior is much, much worse.
I agree with you there, Paul. I just do.
But I know that all over the world, I'm not going to convince anybody.
No, you might. I mean, the only way we could let's say convince people is just to have conversations about it, right? And I do want to bring up, the devil's advocate point of view here. So let's actually state what Putin said prior to the invasion. So he said this was a special military operation seeking the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. He said, essentially there's, rebel groups that are destabilizing Russia in Ukraine. So that's one cause of invasion. The other point of view is that Ukraine has always been a part of whether we want to call it Russia or the Soviet Union. And this is kind of just reunifying it, right? And then the other one is obviously what we brought up is the NATO expansion itself that's threatening the sovereignty of Russia. So let's start with that first part, though. Was there destabilization from Ukraine taking place? No.
That's just an outright fabrication. Obviously, we know this. The destabilization was going on in the other direction, right? Putin sent in these little green men into Crimea in 2014. He if you're going to believe outright lies that are obviously outright lies, it's hard to have a serious conversation. And those are serious, obviously demonstrable lies. Sorry if I sound adamant about that, but there's just
you've been studying this. You've been studying this for multiple decades. So your involvement in this history is way more thorough than pretty much anyone else on this planet. So I want to make just the point of view, though, of a typical citizen who didn't even know about Ukraine really until maybe this war started, right? Or doesn't really understand even world history. So when you say they're outright lies, there's people out there, and I know this is going to make you angry, but Oliver Stone, all these other, out there making these claims, and not only making these claims, but making these claims with some very significant, I would call it propaganda, but essentially with some very media, whatever it is, but making strong claims that do need, I think, to be debunked in more detail.
Absolutely. And of course, the beauty of the stuff that Oliver Stone does or that the Russian government does is there's an old line from Mark Twain that a lie can go halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its shoes on. So let me try to debunk some of this, right? Over the last 30 years, Russia has, from the beginning, said we don't accept, various Russian elites have said, we don't accept Ukraine's independence. However, Russia signed a treaty, two treaties, in fact, right? The Budapest Memorandum in 1994, and then the Russia-Ukraine Friendship Treaty in 1997, saying we, the Russian government, respect and guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity, right? Russia is also, of course, a signatory to the UN Charter, which guarantees the same thing. So these are legally binding documents. Was Ukraine sending agents into Russia? Nobody's produced any evidence that I know of, and it doesn't even meet the sort of common sense test, right? In the sense of Ukraine doesn't have enough power, they don't have enough skill, they're barely trying to, right? They're just trying to keep their own country afloat. So, you can say things like that, right? I can say that Putin is controlled mentally by men from Jupiter. Can you prove me wrong? Can you prove me wrong? No, of course not, but it's ludicrous. So I think the more interesting stuff we should focus on is not the outright lies, but this idea that that Ukraine, first of all, Ukraine was always part of Russia, right? Let's tackle that one. Well, actually not true, right? Ukraine has been controlled by Russia for big chunks of many recent centuries, right? But not all. The big chunk of Ukraine was only controlled by Russia at the end of World War II, right? So it's fairly recent. But other parts of Ukraine were taken over by Russia violently in early decades. So my whataboutism to my friends in, let's just say, South Asia, for example, would be if Ukraine, which was colonized by Ukraine 300 years ago, should be part of Russia, why shouldn't India be part of the British Raj, right? It's just, to me, it's silliness, right? Because I want to be clear. I'm not advocating that India be part of the British Raj. I'm just saying the idea that somebody conquers something 300 years ago violently, and that means it somehow has a right to own it today, is to endorse all the imperialism that was so terrible for so many people around the planet for these centuries. And it seems spectacularly hypocritical, and I just don't get it. Mm-hmm. The Russian Empire was called the Russian Empire for a reason, right? None of those people had any free will or any right to vote. They were conquered by Russia. Mm-hmm. Just like India and Pakistan were taken over by the British, or South America and Latin America was taken over by Spain and Portugal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing.
No, that does make sense. And let's just talk about the Western expansion, because this is a little bit interesting to me too.
Yeah.
Because actually, historically, has Russia been seen as part of the West? If we look back, let's say 100 years or so, it seems more recent that they've kind of relabeled themselves.
This has always been a great debate ever since Peter the Great, right? And so to be clear, Peter the Great ruled Russia from 1696 to 1725. And he was the first Russian ruler that really had this idea of Russia as a Western-oriented country, right? And he built the capital of St. Petersburg, moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, precisely because it was on the Baltic Sea looking towards Europe. And it's been a sort of a constant theme in Russian history since then. Are we not part of Europe or the West? To the extent we are, what does that mean for us?
And also, can you just real quick just expand on when we say West, we're not necessarily talking about geography here either, right? Are we talking about like ideal? Can you just talk like briefly 2 sentences on that? What do we mean?
So go back to the time of Peter the Great. The West meant at that time, it meant enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment. It meant science. It meant literacy. It meant the printing press, right? And it was starting to mean, although it was very early stages at that point in time, right? The West was starting this move toward limited government, right? What eventually is going to become liberal democracy. Not much of that in the Europe of 1700, let's be honest. But Britain had a parliament, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the idea. And of course it meant, right, as well, it meant economic growth. Because I'm going to pick a random year, 1500 or 1400 is probably a better year to pick. Europe was not richer than any other place on the planet, right? By 1700, 1800, Europe is becoming spectacularly wealthy and powerful, right, compared to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. How does that happen? It's a fascinating tale, and there's a lot of debate about it. But Russia basically says, we want to be part of that, not part of this historical, Asiatic, quote unquote, backwards, right? Those were the kinds of ideas, the things that Peter the Great thought he was running from, and that Russian modernizers have been trying to move away from ever since.
That makes sense, but right now the West, I mean, everything you brought up, right? Like the advancements, the intellectual progress, the printing, all of that stuff. Now the East has all of this in spades. So right now when we talk about it, specifically when Putin even brings up the West, what delineation are we actually bringing up, the West in regards to? Well,
so when Putin talks about the West now, right now what he's talking about is a decadent West that has let liberal democracy get in the way of state power. It's let liberal democracy get in the way of powerful nationalism. And it's had modern conceptions of women's rights, gay rights, and things like that destroy traditional notions of family, masculinity, and so on and so forth. And of course, that part of Putin's agenda has a great deal of sympathy in a lot of places around the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was almost a fight back against, I'm going to use this word, against Western wokeism, I would say, right? It probably appeals to quite a few people here in the West, in fact, some of the stuff he just said recently.
Absolutely, but I'm not an historian, but I probably read more history than the average person does. There has been this kind of thing repeatedly in Russian history, where one generation says, we've got to adopt all these Western ideas, and the next generation comes along and says, no, those are decadent. We need to go back to a more Russian spirituality. It's happened it happened in the 20th century, happened in the 19th century, and so on. So this push and tug between the idea that Russia wants to move forward like the West, and Russia wants to be apart from the West because it wants to leave aside the decadent parts of the West, that's been going on for centuries. And of course, the quest is always, it seems to me, for the people who don't want to adopt our decadent ideas is, can we get the economic wealth and growth? Can we get the military power, right, without all that other stuff that we don't like? Mm-hmm. And of course, in a way, this is what China is about now as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, and I just want to come back to where we when we started this, in a sense, was where so now it really is. I guess he's framed it as they're fighting against Western expansion, right? So Western countries, over the past, 4 or 5 decades, they seem to have had free reign, kind of doing and exerting their power to some degree, right? So the pushback against with India and China and even Russia is that this needs to stop. So what's the argument against that?
So who forced the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary to join the European Union and NATO?
I assume they chose themselves.
When did somebody invade those countries? Right? What was the country? Let's just say historically in the 20th century, what's the country that invaded those countries?
Mm-hmm.
Most recently, the Soviet Union, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Those countries begged. This was not. We call it NATO expansion, and I'm fine with that terminology. But of course, it wasn't unwilling expansion. Those countries were begging NATO and begging the European Union to be let in. And that's the fundamental difference, is they begged to be part of what were the most important institutions in Europe, in part because they were afraid of Russia, right? And in part because they wanted part of that wealth-generating mechanism and democracy-generating mechanism, because they had been occupied by Soviet Russian communists for the last 45 years. Ukraine has quite clearly said, no, thank you. We do not want to be part of your Russian world. We don't want to be part of your Russian economic organization. We don't want to be part of your Russian political organization. We want to go in the other direction. So there's this fundamental distinction between sovereign countries being allowed to do what they want and sovereign countries being conquered by their neighbors. And again, it's just, to me, it's massively hypocritical to say it's okay for Russia to conquer its neighbors, but all this other conquering is not okay.
I think you put forward the strongest argument yet, and just this moral confusion that exists here, if anyone still has any. I mean, there's some easy frameworks here to use. I mean, would you rather live under Putin's Russia, or would you rather live in the United States or even India or anywhere else? Right? I think there's an obvious answer to that question if you're wondering, what type of system is going to work better in the long run. And like you said, you brought it up. The countries that are joining NATO are doing it voluntarily. The people who come to America and to Western countries, they do it voluntarily. We're not forcing them to do it. They do it for economic reasons, for freedom of expression, for freedom of religion, for all these what we would call Western ideals, but the same ideals that I think most of humanity values very greatly. So I think we addressed that point. Next thing, I'm going to pause it here, but then we're going to continue the discussion on what we have essentially to look forward to as 2023 plays out for both Ukraine, Russia, and the world.
Good.